Well, I get a sense it's all coming together. It's all coming together. But on September 21st, 4 years ago, I was standing at this exact same spot on the stage with Mary Robinson. She mentioned the meeting. We organized a rally of union members called Jobs, Justice, Climate. And it was a meeting organized during Climate Week in the lead up to the Copenhagen talks. You'll remember those talks. My job that night was to introduce Richard Trumka, the president of the AFL-CIO. He'd only been president for 5 days, and he was now the leader of an 11 million member organization consisting of 60 unions, one of the largest labor organizations in the world. And to me, it was very encouraging when Richard said the AFL-CIO and the unions of North America are strongly on board the global campaign to reduce emissions and stabilize climate. Now, a lot of people make those speeches, but it's not easy for a labor leader to make that speech or to make those comments. And I think many of you in the audience know the reason why. It was an important moment because labor had opposed the Kyoto Protocol in the 1990s. It was the only labor movement in the world, actually, to actually oppose the Kyoto Treaty. And it did so because it felt a treaty that put constraints on the US at a time when jobs were being outsourced to countries like China was going to mean less work, fewer members, and more hardship for union members and working families in the United States. And of course, they had a point. That said, the hopes were dashed in Copenhagen. We never got a global agreement. And the truth be told, and I think the truth should be told, US unions were mostly happy with that outcome. That's the reality. They really didn't want a binding global agreement. They went to Copenhagen talking about the need to reduce emissions, but they were totally comfortable with the Copenhagen Accord, at least for the most part. 4 years later, things have changed. And I want to tell you a little story, a personal story in some respects, because I was very involved in it, although I take very little credit for the outcome. It's the story of the Keystone XL pipeline and what happened in the labor movement. Many of you have probably followed the discussions in the press about unions being for the pipeline, and there's a lot of truth to that. But the story of Keystone XL is really also a story of the People's Climate March, at least in the context of labor. And I'll just try to explain that in a moment. This is a story of leadership, in fact, of not leadership of political leaders or of heads of state, but of union men and women who decided that they wanted their movement to be on the right side of history on a very, very controversial question. In 2008, the Cornell Global Labor Institute, which I directed then, I co-direct it now, convened a body called the Labor Leaders Climate Forum. Obama was elected. We felt, or we were expecting a Democrat to be elected during that time. There was talk of a climate bill, and we got all the union leaders together and said, what are we going to do? Can we be on the right side of this question? The climate bill, there was progress. Most of the unions agreed that we needed a climate bill, that we needed to reduce emissions. There was arguments about how much, how fast. There were concerns. I won't deny that. But there was very much a strong commitment to be part of the solution and not to support the problem, which is the expansion and ongoing use of fossil fuels leading to ever higher levels of global warming pollution. But the bill didn't happen, and this is where we see now, and at this late hour, I don't want to go into too much detail, but there was a polarization in the labor community. The oil and gas industry jumped on the situation and approached some unions, mostly from the building trades, and said, we want you to form an oil and gas industry labor management committee. And there's an old joke in the labor movement that if some unions will build their own gallows as long as it was done with union labor. And it's a funny joke, except it's lost some of its humor now in the context of climate change and the rise of the extreme energy agenda. But this goes beyond a project-by-project alliance with individual employers to sometimes do projects that really communities don't even want, like the Atlantic Yards, for example, in Brooklyn, which was a big fight in the past years. This was a strategic alliance, and I'll just quote from the statement that was released at the time by that part of the labor community and the industry. It says, labor and the natural oil and gas industries have united to be a healthy and thriving part of the 21st century American economy. We understand the importance of a strong relationship between labor and the companies that will harvest the wealth of untapped oil and gas resources. And so we see the beginnings, not the beginnings, but another important moment of the rise of the extreme energy agenda in North America: tar sands development, fracking, export of coal, mountaintop removal, strip mining, and on and on. And some unions were enlisted in that effort, not because necessarily they wanted to, but they were abandoned by a policy structure in the United States that couldn't deliver on a climate deal because there were too many concessions made to the fossil fuel corporations, and it played into the hands of conservative forces in America who then basically killed the bill. So when people say, oh, those unions again, bear in mind that if you lose a union job in the United States in the year 2014, you lose health coverage, you lose pensions, you lose income in a way that no other country in the industrialized world, or the modern industrialized world, actually witnesses. So it's a big, big thing. So when a union worker in particular, loses their job in the United States, and we have to bear that in mind when we talk about the labor community and its positions on climate and on environment in more general. But this rise of the extreme energy agenda, normally the agreement to support the Keystone XL pipeline and the oil and gas industries would have got a roll of the eyes of other union leaders who probably would have wished for a different outcome, but they felt that nothing could be done. This time, it was different. We convened another meeting. We brought the union leaders together, including those who supported Keystone XL, and we said, let's think through what this means, consider the implications for the labor movement, for the environment, and for our allies, our social allies, indigenous people, farmers, ranchers, students, and youth. If we turn away from those constituencies, if we turn away from planet Earth itself, what will our movement be like as a moral force in society? We didn't win the arguments with some unions because they'd already signed agreements with the companies, TransCanada being the one to build Keystone XL. And the media was basically trumpeting the message, jobs, 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 on and on, the jobs mantra, we need jobs. And it was being echoed in some corners of the labor movement. I was fortunate enough to be able to help write a study called Pipe Dreams, Jobs Gained and Jobs Lost in the Construction of the Keystone XL Pipeline. I didn't realize when I was writing it with other colleagues what was going to happen the day after that report was released. The phone never stopped ringing. There was absolute bedlam because we exposed the numbers of TransCanada Corporation, so much so that their $300,000 study that said there was going to be 120,000 jobs in the pipeline had to be taken off of their website because we completely blew them out of the water. Faced with these numbers, faced with these discussions, two unions, the Amalgamated Transit Union and the Transport Workers Union, took a decision in August 2011 to make a statement against the pipeline. The pro-unions, the pro-Keystone unions, said they had no right to do so. It's not appropriate for a union to interfere with the work of another union. This is basically a no-no in trade union culture. And those unions said, you're wrong. We have to stand up for our passengers who breathe foul air, for the communities suffering from asthma. We have to stand up for those living near refineries who are refining tar sands oil or will be refining, and we have to stand up for the ecosystems that sustain life. And that was the beginning of a new perspective in the Labour community. Following that, just months later, Domestic Workers United, a new organization that represents 2 million home care workers, 99% of them are women, and just about 90% of them are immigrant women of color, who come from islands like the Caribbean islands and the small island states and other countries that are beginning to be ravaged by climate change, that they also came out and said, we are against a pipeline. And what are domestic workers doing opposing a pipeline? That was the question that was raised, but they did the right thing and they laid a marker down for others. Sometime later, I went to the office of National Nurses United in California, and she said, Roseanne DeMauro, the president of the union, she said, you want me and my union to oppose the Keystone XL pipeline? I said, I have absolutely no apology making that request, and she said, absolutely no problem. The nurses not only opposed the pipeline, they had a march over the Golden Gate Bridge of nurses dressed in red saying no to climate change, no to the Keystone XL pipeline. The New York State Nurses Association also came out and opposed the pipeline. They are also the very unions, they just don't take a position. They are offering relief for the victims of Typhoon Yolanda in the Philippines. Thousands of nurses from the United States, from the nurses' unions, organized by the unions, went to that relief effort. New York State Nurses Association were right down there in the front lines, helping out relief after Sandy. So they see climate change close up, and they are part of this rising constituency of unions, a new labor movement, informed by a new social vision, a narrative that assists or wants to bring nature into alignment with work and economy. We have to have this new perspective. So I'll close with a couple of additional points on this. All of the New York area unions have endorsed the People's Climate March. That is not a small thing. Tomorrow, we will see thousands of healthcare workers, doctors, nurses. We will see the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, one of the unions that actually endorsed the pipeline, are mobilizing at least 1,000 electricians, hard hats, to be on the march tomorrow. I am told by my friends in the Amalgamated Transit Union and Transport Workers Union, we can expect at least 2,000 transit workers dressed in union uniforms. So when we talk about leadership and we're trying to address this issue tonight, I think those unions in difficult times, when the labor movement is under attack, when they know that there is the need for jobs, there is the need for decent paid work, that they are prepared to stand up, and other unions are following them, not just to oppose the extreme energy agenda of the oil, coal, and gas industry, but also to fight for a global climate agreement that we'll see echoed in the People's Climate March tomorrow. I came from a meeting today from a project that I was very instrumental in setting up, called Trade Unions for Energy Democracy. Because what's going to happen after the march? I respectfully disagree with what Lester Brown said about the rise of renewable power all over the world and the inexorable growth of wind and solar and other forms of renewable power. Yes, it is growing, but I look at those figures differently. I don't believe we will have a carbon-free power generation system, which we desperately need to reach climate goals, until we take on the fossil fuel corporations and until and when I say take them on, I don't mean divest, although I really support the brave work people in the divestment movement are doing. I don't mean regulate, I mean expropriate. I mean take them over. This is planetary survival we're talking about here. People say it cannot be done, they're far too powerful. But I tell you this, if we woke up tomorrow morning and President Obama was on TV and said, yesterday, having looked at the data of global warming and seeing the source of global warming emissions, I believe it is in the best interest of the American people to pass an executive order freezing the assets of the fossil fuel corporations immediately. And I'll finish the president's speech with these words. And I'm encouraging everybody to go to their city hall and their town square to show your support for this action from the White House. Will there be a mass movement against that? No, but there will be a strong movement in favor of it. It was done in the New Deal. We were discussing today the Rural Electrification Administration that was set up under the New Deal, a time when only 10% of rural families had electricity. The private corporations refused to electrify the rural areas because the people who would get the electrification couldn't afford to pay for the electricity, and secondly, they would make no profit from the venture. The Roosevelt administration basically said, please get out of the way. We're putting up a fund. We're setting up energy cooperatives all over the central and southern United States. Within 20 years, 97% of rural areas were connected. It was done inexpensively. It was done transparently. And the final message of that Rural Electrification Administration was no private corporation need apply for the loans. And Milton Friedman and the American Heritage Foundation went absolutely ballistic, and they waged a campaign for 20 years, but the job was done. It was done then. We can do it now. Let's go forward to renewable power. Let's build the people's climate movement, and let's all be on the streets tomorrow. Thank you.